Hello everyone, today we talk for the quasi-anniversary, that would be the day after I publish this, the Battle of Hastings of 1066. I am a medieval warfare based channel, thus I couldn't avoid sooner or later to talk about this battle. It's actually amazing that in several years that had not come up, mostly from the cycle. This is actually in fact a special, right? So willingly picked single topic for the anniversary, also because I had never covered it before. Naturally, we talked about Normandy, the Normans, Anglo-Norman England, the same Anglo-Danish, actually not much of the Anglo-Danish period per se, but of course the Anglo-Saxon one, broadly meant. As I said in my first video of the introductory series to the American Civil War, I'm also relatively embarrassed to discuss this topic in front of a dominantly Anglosphere audience. This video is not part of the tactical analysis one that you can find among my playlists. It's part of a series that I use the term series pretty unspecifically. All right. What I mean is, in this case especially, it's a kind of video that I started making from some here, discussing battles in their importance, in their broader political and strategical context, also talking about the actual engagement, however not focusing on it. In that case, I will have to analyze the primary sources, as I always do with, you've seen in fact what the tactical analysis content is about. So this is different, all right, but it's meant, of course, to address the broader relevance of one of the single most important battles in the history of mankind, right? This is not just a cliche to, you know that I don't content too much. I always launch some sort of strails to sort of the Anglosphere in a way or another, even though, as you know, in a very friendly way. On the contrary, I'm very appreciative of Anglo-Saxon culture in general, historically, politically, culturally. So you understand that Hastings is one of those moments where also you can't avoid just to love it if you know how, like, what is to be learned from this battle that we will in part see today. But it's also important, in fact, to frame this clash in, let's say, in a perspective that is not like everybody knows what Hastings was, and generally speaking, like even the ways in which the battle is told, without comparing it to others. If I were to be honest, like studying this battle for a specialist in tactical reconstruction, not because Hastings is not particularly interesting in a tactical sense, but it's actually a pretty average clash of the big ones that you can encounter in this period. We've seen recently, for example, the Battle of Dyrrhachion. It is also a bit like the Balkan Hastings, because, as you know, there were Normans and Anglo-Saxons, Anglo-Danish from both sides, between the Siculo-Normans and the Byzantines. And there are so many other encounters in the rest of the Middle Ages that are, I think, particularly important, in that, for the obvious reason, that were not sung by the major Anglo-Saxon, say, you could say, amplified narrative in a broader global sense, considered in a different way and or secondary. This is actually a very important topic for Schwerpunkt, because I increasingly care really about this aspect that I cope with every day. In a sense, the larger the channel gets, that is to say, observing sort of the most different reactions to different content that are evidently not based on a criterion of historical relevance, and or maybe I understand, yes, that it's even possible that I would get less views for the Battle of Hastings, given that everybody has covered it, everybody has listened to it, so there is not much to learn. There may be a factor in that lack of curiosity, right? If anything, I think that you would watch this video at best because I'm talking about the battle rather than the battle itself, if you're already well acquainted with it. Maybe you want to highlight, criticize, say, certain aspects of my narrative. That's also a thing, competitively on YouTube. However, it's also relevant to talk Hastings in, I think, a broader European context, right? Medieval history does not end to just specific segments of northwestern European history of the broader continent, including the British Isles, which will already trigger someone in this sense, but I'm joking, of course. But relative to, in fact, like this, I don't know, there is a guy, for example, there are the random comments that I even talk about, but without allowing them, because I think they're too bad in that sense. Said something like, but if the English at Crecy could have just the Kingdom of England, because it was an issue of the size of medieval armies, that, as you know, I actually point out the fact it's not that they were bigger than we think, but people pick, like in this case, the narrower examples, essentially implicitly, sometimes unawarely declaring that they do not know anything about an incredibly narrowly regional dimension of the whole things. If the English at Crecy had only, a bit more than 10,000 men, how could medieval armies be so big? Because you think that the English army at Crecy was normally big, in a medieval context. It was average or even under average compared to the, broader regional forces that were moved in the bigger campaigns. And so you understand that there is just one sort of not necessarily self, but you understand where that comes from in the broader global cultural dynamics, referentiality, which is painful because not just, of course, English history, of course, it is very important, but in this very sense is part of a broader system. And if you do not understand this system, how you can understand even English history, or any other for that matter, in that context? Again, this is no criticism whatsoever toward the British, towards the Americans, that actually are, in most cases, actually more educated, more aware of history in general than other people. I can speak from continental Europe. Like, the youth is not really that traditional. It's another actually Anglosphere problem, especially in the United States, that you think that here we're sort of traditional in some ways we are, but in many others, including knowing anything about your own history, you have to think twice about that. And yes, unfortunately, that's the problem, right? We don't, such things do not come up with a standard pack, like a broader conservative outlook, has unfortunately nothing to do with traditional or historical or cultural awareness. So, talking about the Battle of Hastings, I will follow just a pretty ordinary narrative and then just make some considerations along the way. Without much further ado, let's get to it. As we were pointing out, this battle really presents itself by itself, right? There is no need to add how relevant, how decisive it was within the, say, across the channel, in a broader sense, how much from 1066 changed. You could even imagine, as you know, I don't like what ifs, but this is one of those moments that make you think about it. Like, had the Normans lost, right? Had Harold won, both over, in fact, as he did, the Norse in the north and the Normans in the south, and they are two different things indeed by that point, the world would have really been very different. We cannot say how that would have been, because we have already enough problems to reconstruct history as it happened. You can imagine, the relevance of what could have been, but you can understand that in the immediate aftermath of an Anglo-Saxon victory, an Anglo-Danish victory, Britain, England specifically, would have remained actually more similar to, say, I don't know, a Scandinavian country rather than one of the continent strictly meant. This is debatable, of course, because the Frankish cultural dominance had been a big deal. This is often forgotten when talking Anglo-Saxon history in general throughout the centuries. Indeed, even Anglo-Danish England by this point was particularly ahead compared, say, to Scandinavia. And actually part of the reason why William the Conqueror could ideate, to begin with, the accomplishment that would bring him such nickname over superseding the bastard, was connected to this advancement of Anglo-Danish England that by the time of the Norman conquest was actually one of the better organized, right, administered countries in Europe, right. There is an early sense of realm of centrality in English history that dates back to very back in time, really, compared to the general sense of but they were divided. There was the so-called Eptarchy. There is something that goes beyond political unity, and I think especially in Anglo-Saxon history in spirit, like for example the imperial Bretwalda, in fact, awareness that the British Isles belonged to the English was already there. You can argue that the moment to which Hengist and Orsa set foot on the main island. I discussed this elsewhere, but of course, in spite of the Norman, which means specifically a Western Frankish, right? Don't confuse this as we say the word Normans, so they were kind of like the Vikings. Actually, not, right? Even if there was a genetic continuity in some cases, of course, that Normandy can be still found, especially in relatively isolated areas like the Cotentin and so on. The entire political, military, social, cultural language itself, and of course also the majority population was radically Western Frankish in everything, right? There is a slighter, again, yes, a tendency toward that gravitation, even toward that broader Anglo-Scandinavian, and even beyond, right? There is a connection there, as you know, through Ruthenia, even Constantinople. So the world is becoming small. The Norman conquest of England actually highlighting how much, right? In fact, it seems as if the Battle of Hastings was almost scripted, right? Giving rise to also what can be considered, as you know, the first extraordinary comic strip in history. If you visit Bayeux, as with Normandy, that I highly recommend, of course, you must visit the Bayeux, the Tapestry Museum, the Musée de la Tapisserie, that's how it's called in French, and it's really worth that experience. There is more than much, but what else could you want more than the Bayeux Tapestry? There are a bunch of actually pretty accurate statues of William the Conqueror, Norman knights, Norman warriors, and so on. It's pretty interesting, and the sensation is unique. Aside from the beauty, say, of the cathedral, the references to the brotherhood between the French and the Germans from the World War I manuscript I visited. That in 2014 it was also the 7th anniversary of the landings, but also the 100th of the beginning of the First World War. So just yesterday I published a video on Verdun that also somehow contains a 6. Well, okay, we're deliberating regarding the connections to 1066. In any case, you can really feel in Normandy, when you visit Rouen, Caen, and so on, that connection, that sense of the north opening up to a conquest and to almost a koiné also, in spite of the important differences existing between the kingdom of the Western Franks, the kingdom of the English, the same Scandinavia, the Celtic fringe. The Battle of Hastings is pretty much like the catalyst of this process. It's the I would say, the final affirmation of the historical hierarchy existing in this area. It's a great settler in many ways, one of, by the way, extreme violence. The harrying of the north was really something, aside from the Saxon south, had basically called the Normans in, of course, toward the Midlands. It was, in fact, the outer Celto-Norse fringe that had something to say about this all. But aside from some other disturbances, we've seen, for example, the Battle of Largs, in that case, from Norway to Scotland, rather. There is a final settlement of what fundamentally will remain, even in the wake of a very well-established dimension. Much of the world that we see, I say the world, not the British Isles, just because that's where it all stemmed from in terms of the Anglosphere, and what could be accomplished by the Kingdom of England in great many ways started, of course, at that point. September 25th, 1066, proved fateful for King Harold II of England. In the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the Anglo-Danish ruler triumphed over the Norwegian Harold, who was also a claimant to the English throne, revealing, again, how, also that's another aspect that is somehow overlooked, the sort of the crisis that the system had undergone in spite of its advancement, with the, in fact, degradation of the early Anglo-Saxon, almost sort of civic order, the essentially the structural damage that the North had made. And so in spite of, great rulers like the Great, who was arguably one of the greatest kings of England, albeit not being in that sense, and that was not, in fact, much of the discriminant at the time, an Englishman himself, which speaks of a crisis, right? A Norman and Norwegian army would have not simply invaded in 1066 if there hadn't been specific issues within the same Anglo-Danish war. The threats, we will talk briefly now about the Battle of Stamford Bridge, that we will surely treat in tactical analysis, were far from over. Like on that very day, Duke William of Normandy set sail from France, and known as William the Conqueror, he was the illegitimate son of Duke Robert I of Normandy and his concubine Herleva. William also laid claim to the Kingdom of England and was a cousin of the same King Edward, who held him in such high regard that he allegedly promised him the throne in the event of his death without an heir. Edward, a devout Catholic who would later be known as the Confessor for this reason, and also starting a strain of other Edwards in English royal history, starting from Henry III, who was particularly devout to him, to call, in fact, his son Longshank Edward I. He'll continue with other two Edwards just in a row, was married, but there are indications that the marriage was never consummated. And so, the dynastic problem. Edward the Confessor, in this sense, and also because of Henry III choice, if you wonder what that was, would represent that Anglo-Saxon legacy in many ways. In fact, Henry III decided to start to reactivate this onomastics in the Kingdom of England after the Battle of Bouvines, and the failure, in fact, of his father John, that would enclose England a bit more within the narrow straits of the Channel, just a few other French possessions, and projecting it, in fact, towards Britain, thus needing, in a way, to resume that Anglo-Saxon background. As you know, still at the time, such we're still talking about the Angevin dynasty that were still, albeit via female line, the descendants of the House of Normandy, were essentially French rulers, Western Frankish ones. Surely they had anglicized, but to also much of the establishment descending from the one arriving from the continent under William the Conqueror, France was still seen and felt and lived, as a matter of fact, because many of them actually lived there, as the preferential home. Today we do not talk, of course, about the after, because we don't have time, and we have covered it to some extent. We'll have to come back on it. Recently, as you know, I made a video about Henry I, Familia Regis. It's important to understand how consequentially quick the Norman succession really was on the English throne. In 1042, King Edward of the Angles, that's actually the proper term. It was the people really that chose actively the ruler. It was actually like going both ways, but of course it was a sense of still this population that had not known, for example, feudalism, and not to actually a great advantage of the whole system. Exactly that aforementioned weakness had come from the, if you want, the relative backwardness that especially the Viking influence had brought to an otherwise sort of quite publicly developed, for the times and the places, Anglo-Saxon administrative system. There was a privatization, a tendency towards feudalization as well, but not to the point of creating a real feudal state. Scandinavia would take much longer to have that fully kicking in, essentially the 13th century. Instead, Normandy, in spite of its more primitive background, was really way more ahead in that, and so that would help, in spite of its radical brutality, to channel the Anglo-Danish potential into that higher form of rule. There's a lot of criticism about this, probably from people who think that mostly like just people have to be given sort of a greater role in the business. The point is, at the time, it was universally recognized that if you couldn't obtain that, it was primarily your fault, right? And that the conqueror was inherently superior to you, right? So it's useless to whine about that, and it's on the contrary, like extremely important to search for the reasons of that defeat, because let's be honest, the defeated are almost always more interesting than the winners, exactly because of, just imagine if that had happened to you, and how would you justify it? How would you explain that, right, to your own family, to the people that had believed in you? That's a very important aspect of the story. King Edward was son of Ethelred II and the Norman Emma, and he began to favor, in part for this ancestry, but it was more eminently a political reason, the, can say, French faction in his appointments. I will say English, French, not to be too pedantic, but of course you know what we mean here. Provoking discontent, in fact, among the courtiers who resisted foreign interference. This all pretty well connects, by the way, with what we were pointing out before regarding the broader civilizational value of the Norman conquest. Because you can see, as you know how the story went, that essentially Edward indicated William as his heir on the English throne, regardless of what happened also later. We will never fully know what was the actual intention on his deathbed in allegedly supporting Harold Godwin. So it was a hell of a ruler in many ways. We will talk about that also from a military point of view, because the Anglo-Saxon, the Anglo-Danish military system was also way more flexible than we tend to imagine it, like the story of they didn't have cavalry or they didn't use it for some reason. There was actually much more to that. I made lots of videos about Anglo-Saxon warfare that I think it's It's incredibly important to study and incredibly fascinating. And the sense being that, of course, an Anglo-Danish establishment ruling over the realm was, of course, pretty jealous of their prerogatives. Monarchs tend, however, to be, in that sense, not much tyrants, as also, that's why I said before all that stuff about the Anglo sphere. I respect, it's always a double-threaded thing. Like, you can be a tyrant, but also not, right? And it really depends on what's happening there. And this oligarchy was not necessarily the best one to rule the country. Not that they were even particularly bad or evil or incapable. Absolutely not. But the fact that they were also defeated, and that there wasn't just a king deciding something strange here, but a Saxon South that was the more developed, the more internationally connected, the richer, the one that would actually keep maintaining the power, that was the one to essentially call the Normans and allowing them to rule from there, should make you think about the war, right? Because, of course, there's no need to digress on the traditional concept of kingship, nor the fact that still, of course, the same Saxons understood that there were limits to royal authority, and they would make it clear, but realized probably that that was for the best, and that was to actually defend their own condition rather than something more dysfunctionally going on in the way that the Anglo-Danish period had. So Harold Godwinson is a hell of a character in this, but not necessarily we should simply equate this to an absolute Englishness just per se. And you must understand the political and social balance and conflict behind that. Count Godwin of Wessex, that was Edward's father-in-law, and his son Harold emerged as the leaders of the very opposition to the French party. However, Harold himself would ultimately outmaneuver the other nobles, and after winning the king's own favor, aimed for the throne. That's what you do. You ride the wave of the stronger opposition, and then you end up being king yourself and doing the exact same thing, except, of course, here there was a rival from the other side of the channel that thought otherwise. It's another story. But if you look at even within the same royal families, all the sort of civil wars more or less follow this pattern. We've seen them often in Germany, in Bohemia, right? It's not about the country goes nowhere. It's all about who, especially as a monarchy, individually rules over it, which is also very different from what the broader establishment can or can't be. In 1064, Edward dispatched Harold to inform William of his future succession plans. However, during the journey, Harold was captured by an enemy and was released by the same Duke William, who compelled him to swear loyalty to his claim to the throne, being well aware, of course, that Harold would try to, of course, seize the English throne for himself and try to oust him from succession, from practical rule anyway. Nonetheless, Harold would, of course, betray his promise, and upon Edward's death, he crowned himself king, provoking William's wrath. Harold Godwinson deserves naturally many videos that we'll make at some point. We'll just point out one aspect about his military curriculum, which tells a lot also about this Anglo-Danish military culture that, as proven at Hastings, was actually pretty effective. At least the whole campaign against the Norwegians and then the back and forth across Britain. That was actually a pretty important story. Remember, here we will not talk about Tostig, for example, and that's also a pretty good one for this sort of incredibly intricate and, in that sense, typically Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Danish issue, right? That's why you need some strong man that manages to unite things for real, even if with the massive trail of blood that the Normans left. Right? Remember that the conquest of England was incredibly bloody. Aside from Hastings, you have the harrying of the north would continue for decades, in which, like, the Normans laid waste to an incredibly large amount of communities. For example, the Norman conquest of Sicily wasn't like that at all. It was sort of gradual, slow. There were lots of sieges, but it was orderly, was more mediated. The Muslims largely left. The Anglo-Saxons resisted much more, right? It was an incredibly brutal history that also, we tend not to tell too much because it's not like it's particularly documented, again, for the importance of the battle, the Norman installment. We know very few. This is still Northern Europe in the 11th century. We can't know that much, right? But just know that, of course, it's not because we can't see it and because the people who did it largely died that we can't understand, of course, that it happened and why, right? So, yes, civilization does come at that cost, right? The main problem, though, is how people fall short of what civilization offers in potential rather than that being a problem in itself, as many think in a sort of loser and self-sabotaging mentality. Anyway, as you know, the death of King Edward the Confessor in January 1066 ignited a dynastic crisis. Harold II, Godwin's son, did not possess clear claims to the throne. Perhaps Edward on his deathbed had appointed him as a protector of the realm while waiting the rightful successor William, or perhaps, as Harold maintained, Edward had indeed named him as his heir. We will never know it for sure. Regardless, seizing the opportunity, Harold secured the support of the Witenagemot, I hope to pronounce it correctly, the assembly of Anglo-Danish noblemen, and proclaimed himself king. Surely that establishment did back him. William was unwilling to cede his claim without a fight and began preparations for an expedition to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. He could not have anticipated that his campaign would evolve into one of the most significant military endeavors in history. That's why at the beginning I was pointing out that, yes, all in all, when you evaluate just the military side of the story, you can say that Hastings is just like a battle like others, of the, at least of the regional scale of the time, which especially for the places was a huge deal. Again, the resources of both contendants were dramatically stretched. This was a climatic confrontation over, literally, as you can see from history, one of the largest legacies, right, in Europe, in world history, to be honest. But it's also a pretty natural one, pretty consequential clash, considering the premises of it all. These peoples were somehow similar. They shared lots of ties, same blood, especially at an aristocratic level already. But the, let's say, the general politics were normally about war. Like the Anglo-Danish would pursue it in a more still seasonal, right, part-time kind of fashion. The Western Franks had instead ingrained like a level of campaigning that, since Carolingian times, literally every year, these were people who spent their entire good season, at least part of their lives, on horseback. What I was saying about Harold is that he was actually a skilled commander who fought on many theaters. What is interesting is that when he fought, as an Anglo-Danish, like at Hastings, he fought in the typical way, right? This essentially phalanx of footmen, variously stratified from an organizational, tactical point of view. But when, for example, he fought against the Welsh on the western border, he and his Anglo-Danish cavalrymen were able to adapt to counter-guerrilla and counter-insurgency strategy and tactics, also using a lot of cavalry, in fact, in that also skirmishing roles, so a quite adaptable one. And when fighting in Normandy, as he did, he would fight as a Norman horseman, right, as a Western Frankish horseman. That obviously shows that the Anglo-Danish nobility was perfectly apt to carry out like heavy cavalry shock tactics, obviously a bit less effectively and especially collectively than that actually makes the difference at large than in fact their Norman counterparts. However, still, right, there was of course a very different type of social stratification in the Anglo-Danish world compared to Normandy that could make that. Right, the Anglo-Saxons didn't have any particular problem considering mounted combat, just their society was not a feudal one, so wealth, albeit not overly abundant, was evenly distributed, which means that there were simply less people capable of fighting on horseback, and that would, however, pose a threat as infantrymen to cavalry. And actually the Battle of Hastings shows how the same top-notch Western cavalry that William the Conqueror could master had important difficulties still at this point, of course, and it would actually maintain it to cope with such heavy infantry. Always remember that while since essentially the second half of the 6th century AD, cavalry in Europe gets the upper hand over infantry, it's not decisive for most of the Middle Ages, meaning that although they will be the dominant arm, they will still be occasionally defeated by infantry. And Hastings was almost about that. Also, it's not until the second half of the 12th century that cavalry in Western Europe truly becomes decisive, for which it's not like infantry is not needed. These armies all fight with combined arms. They need infantry as cavalrymen, but the infantry will not be able until the beginning of the 14th century to actually win by itself, alone, like an only infantry army like the one of Hastings. That was virtually almost all about infantry, and relevantly so. I explained this thoroughly in my Anglo-Saxon warfare videos. Note that I have a massive library about this stuff so that you don't have just to watch only the videos that I upload in the moment. I also talked a lot about Scandinavian warfare that can help understanding that, also the connections that England had with places like the Rus, for example, this time including Constantinople further beyond, right? The Normans were roaming around also the British Isles before Hastings, and which is particularly true also for showing how, in fact, there actually was Norman cavalry used by the Anglo-Saxons from quite early on. I mean, Frankish, also in Carolingian times, etc. And at some point you can't distinguish the Normans, if we narrow it down to that, from the Vikings in some generation before, especially in history, and how did they indeed tour the world as mercenaries. I made a video about medieval mercenaries looking at this. The Saxons, the continental Saxons themselves were actually pretty interesting, say, Europe trotters. And there surely was a connection also between northern Germany, Scandinavia, and Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Danish England, evidently, since ever, right? The Vikings were, after all, not that distant from, nor in time, in space, and culture from the Anglo-Saxons. Throughout their entire, say, independence, we can so say, at least considering the idea of a foreign monarchy coming to rule on them with imposition of arms, that, as we've seen, was, however, still the proof of essentially an Anglo-Saxon consensus at the end of the day. There is no government without the decisive moral majority of the people. So you must understand why the decisive moral majority was so balanced compared to the possibility of having just an Anglo-Danish future and not an Anglo-Norman one. But I'm philosophizing to a degree. A last point regarding that is that, however, it should be pointed out how not just the Anglo-Danish, the Anglo-Normans, let's say, but the very Normans of Normandy did indeed retain part of that infantry bias even after the conquest, right? This is incredibly important to stress. Even though, surely, the Kingdom of England developed towards the 12th to 13th century towards a perfectly homogeneous, like sort of indistinguishable military system from the one of the other big Western European monarchies, to a degree, and especially in the north of England, but also like up to even the Midlands in the south, there was a greater evidence of foot combat, Celto-Norse reminiscence of sort, especially in the fringe areas, and in the very Saxon and Norman heart, you see, as we've seen also recently, in the Battle of Book-to-Hood and so on, proclivity to at least dismounting from horseback when fighting. This has actually nothing to do with, for example, the English tactics of the 100 Years' War that, yes, were very foot-based, but not because the English would have fought otherwise hadn't they been brutally outnumbered. We've seen it in many videos, right? By the 13th century, we can't say technically that England has still the sort of foot bias, and the use of the dismounted men-at-arms and the longbowmen later does not have actually to do with that, because there is no actual evidence that that continuity existed. So in the 13th century, England is very much like an Western feudal thing, like all the other Western elements. Just, you have to think about the costs, right? How armies were levied, in fact, the continuity of the field, as we will see now. Also, it's the obvious Anglo-Saxon way to war, also under the Normans for the wide majority of the subjects. I will cover these topics further in many in-depth videos, so you don't have to worry about me ever forgetting it. But back to 1066. Throughout the summer of that year, Harold remained alert upon learning that William was assembling a large fleet to invade England. However, at the beginning of September, with autumn approaching and proto-feudal obligations necessitating the disbanding of the third, the numerical bulk of his army, he was forced to release his troops so they could return to their fields. Just then, Harold III landed with a significant contingent of Norwegian forces near York, defeating the Northumbrian nobles at the Battle of Fulford, and advanced southward towards London. So the Norwegian king's intentions were pretty clear. Remember that Denmark, at least Norway beyond Denmark, had been part, in fact, of a broader influence and even domination of England to an extent, and what William wanted also the Scandinavian ruler did. By the way, Harold Hardrada is, as you know, one of the most legendary rulers of the Middle Ages, as we properly consider his death the conventional end of the Viking era. Not much really in Scandinavia changed because of his death per se. Things had already been changing from quite a while, and they will keep changing very slowly, but essentially Scandinavians kept doing what they had always done, except they sort of redirected their aims. In that sense, the Norman conquest did bring extra stability to England, to the point, in fact, nobody would attempt such a Scandinavian invasion anymore. On the contrary, sometimes, like the imperial Anglo-Saxon mentality went as far as saying that there was some overlordship, even over some parts of Scandinavia. That's actually a pretty interesting story that nobody really talks about, but I have a friend and colleague that researches this specifically, and if anything, I will smuggle some information from him about it for our Schwerpunkt. I mean our, me and you, not him, Schwerpunkt support. Now, Harold, of course, couldn't simply sit waiting for the enemy giving them the initiative. Thus, he hastily marched north with the Huscarls. In any reserves he could quickly muster, intercepting the enemy at Stamford Bridge on September the 25th, where he achieved a crushing victory over the Norsemen. Harold died in the battle. You know that there is the story of Snorri Sturluson from the 13th century that sort of pairs the death of Harold and Harald in 1066 by, of course, divine judgment, the arrow striking in the eye, which has to do with the traditional concept of providence, so the capacity of seeing the future for the imperial holders. It's like the eye of Ra, like the idea that through your wisdom you will simply mold the universe in your own image. So if God strikes you in the eye, there is definitely something going wrong with your actions. And this is what they would literally believe in their 11th century mentality, regardless of the respective backgrounds. So we talked about the Third and the Huscarls. You know what we're talking about. The Third was the general levy of the Anglo-Danish people, which was also stratified and rota system based, of course, mirroring that aforementioned social background for which most of these forces were infantrymen. It's similar also from, I don't know, look at the Scots, right, and how in a broader British sense, of course, England was much more developed than Scotland at the time. If you look also in relatively feudal times like the 13th century, we've seen it at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, for example. We see that the Scots had an overwhelming amount of infantry cavalry ratio, right, compared to the English. Infantries were always more numerous than cavalries in the respective armies in sedentary Europe, but as we were saying, Britain is slightly poorer and slightly more egalitarian, thus there are less horsemen and more cavalrymen. The Huscarls are the elite of the Anglo-Danish nobility, including the king. They are similar to what we saw with Henry I's Familia Regis, except that's post the Norman invasion. Thus, it's mostly mounted, even though they could definitely dismount, as we've seen at Burgterwood for fighting. The Huscarls do fight on horseback, as we noticed before. They are trained to do so, just they don't do it preferentially. There is something archaic and primitive about this Anglo-Danish mentality that dates back to antiquity, to the migration era, for which, yes, the hero is always a horseman in the European world, but he's also one that can run away more easily, and so also the infantry will compel them, especially from their power, that is decisive in this case, to dismount to fight alongside them. And the British, the Scandinavian ethos still wants, of course, in many ways, that leaders fight, not just command, from the front within the phalanx, in first ranks, so that they're true men that can't run away, that have to physically smash into the enemy lines themselves. There's a lot of, in fact, concreteness in this. Harold Hardrada was a giant physically, like that. Of course, the Scandinavian background was disproportionately as traumatically brutal in ways that we can't even start to recollect, compared to the sort of more gentrified Anglo-Danish world. In comparison, that was surely also not a pretty peaceful or tender environment. This doesn't mean necessarily more effective, as the Battle of Hastings actually shows, but the odds, as we were pointing out also regarding this, were balanced. So the Huskarl was the heavily armored, de facto professional force, taking their names, of course, like there are many etymologies in various Indo-European languages and beyond regarding the connection. I made a video about the Germanic Gefolgschaft explaining this. In this case, with their lord, in this case, connected with the house, with the lord's household, the fact that they lived with a lord that provided them with arms, armor, horses as well. There's a lot of chivalric mentality actually also in the Anglo-Danish world. I made a video specifically on this, and that are really a cut, right? They're very interesting types that you would have not probably liked to meet, especially in combat. And that reflect more broadly that Scandinavian, and this partly also, in fact, Anglo-Saxon tradition that had somewhat remained in the wake more or less of that military model. Except the Scandinavian world during the Viking era was, as we've seen, much more sort of privatized, to also a higher degree of mercenarism that was unknown to the Anglo-Saxons, at least to that scale. Thus, these Huskarls were really just the lord's tags in many ways, and were rewarded with larger, amounts of land. It tended to erode that somehow balancedly administered Anglo-Saxon establishment before the Norse invasions. The Normans instead were so hyper advanced into that same privatization that they had even built a feudal state out of it, and so paradoxically that was a much stronger gluing factor than even what the Anglo-Saxons had historically tried to maintain, also during the Anglo-Danish period. That's how it went. Meanwhile, William had landed, compelling Harold to make a forced march southward with the survivors of his army in a desperate attempt to confront him, but to no avail. There are interesting studies that try to calculate, literally, on the basis of the numbers we will see now, how much, say, supplies were needed to mobilize, because at this point, as we've seen, the Firth had been partially demobilized, but they had to call them back because of the emergency, to make it do back and forth across Britain, stretching the country's resources for such enormous stress constituted by tens of thousands of men, summing altogether the Norwegians, the Anglo-Danish, and the Normans. The task ahead both contendants was daunting, indeed exactly given such limited resources. However, the Duke of Normandy displayed exceptional organizational skills that are at this point the standard pack, in fact, of that advanced Western Frankish military culture as well, because bigger state, bigger order, more resources, bring to a lot of other supporting capacities. In fact, for an army, to cross the English Channel that separated him from Britain, at least 700 vessels would be required, about 200 of which were necessary solely for transporting horses, of course. As we know, Western Frankish military culture was very much about this increasingly hyper-disciplined, thickly packed shock cavalry charge tactics that stem from the enormous wealth that the individual knights had, given their large estates, just to spend their entire life training for war, including fighting it. A war horse, even just living, consumes an incredible amount of water, of fodder. So also the logistical strains put in such operation, again, all the ships, all the crews, plus the army, it's an enormous thing for the times and the places. To construct these specialized ships, William summoned skilled artisans, notoriously from Constantinople itself, showing how also, regardless of the various competition existing between the West and the East, of course, the Normans were a bit away. On the Bosphorus, there were international connections, there were money that would make these shipbuilders come up to this relatively wild north, directing them to focus exclusively on the intricate framework of the vessels, while also, of course, local carpenters, some of which are beautifully depicted on the Bayeux tapestry, like the entirety of this enterprise, would take care of the finishing touches. We will at some point see in greater detail what all William's English expedition would amount to. Now, William set up his camp on the Norman coast, covering an area of over 100 hectares. You have to scatter these troops because, hygienically speaking, such enormous concentration of men and horses is incredibly dangerous. We'll talk about this also at times more disgusting aspect of the war, but these men knew how to make war as far as the organization of the sanitary issues were concerned as well. In this camp, William gathered 14,000 men and 2,000 to 3,000 horses for his army, planning to remain encamped for about a month there. William's army was polyglot, with a main Norman component and two smaller groups made up of Bretons and Franco-Flemish that, as you know, would participate to the, not just to the conquest, but to the settlement, right? There was a general mythology, especially from the time we can specifically document the various genealogies, made up or not, because it was incredibly prestigious to claim that you descended from someone that had settled there, specifically from William's expedition, even though there were people who were there from before and they were just left there by the Normans, sometimes same Normans, or Bretons or Flemish, and others had come later, of course. The Bretons, as you know, they were all, think about the Arthurian legions, there was all a mix of influxes. The Bretons were a Celtic people. They actually took this name from the fact that they had many of their ancestors had come from Britain because of the Anglo-Saxon conquest of the same, and so as refugees, and they were pretty skilled horsemen, bit with a lighter bias than the Western Franks that instead pioneered probably the heaviest cavalry. But it was the Bretons specifically that taught the Norse settlers in the lower Sand Basin, the moment the Duchy of Normandy was established under the King Charles the Simple, to actually horse ride, to fight extensively on horseback. Actually, Vikings had pretty large cavalry contingents. relatively to their capacities. So it's not that they would quite literally learn it from them, but surely also that constant frontier warfare between Normandy, Maine, Brittany, the same Ile-de-France, the same Flanders would bring to that. The Flemish were a bit more foot biased because they were a bit more Germanic from the Austrasian, at least not quite, but it was part of Neustria largely, but say less sort of stratified and poorer word at that point, because the Flemish would actually boom from the later centuries onwards economically, as you know. So that together in William's army there were no more than 7,500 veteran fighters. It was an army of essentially semi-professionals, right, or full professionals, especially for the elite, accompanied by nearly an equal number of sailors, servants, and support personnel, which as an expedition is massive. William's tidiness is evident also in such reduced numbers. It's better to have qualified troops, and yes, even risking them in crossing the channel, like we never know in autumn what can happen there. The same House of Normandy would notoriously be cut short by a shipwreck in the 12th century. William's forces operationally comprised 3 distinct armies, although they shared identical troop types and quality. The elite contingent consisted of 2,000 noble knights, more than half of whom were Normans. Armed with lances and swords, they wore long chainmail and wielded elongated teardrop-shaped shields. I made some videos about Norman warfare, also as far as military historical units go, specifically about the Italo-Normans, but we will extend. I made a general video about English and Welsh warfare this era. Their primary strength lay in their formidable lance charges, as we were pointing out before, which could shatter enemy infantry formations, creating gaps in lines that were often inexperienced or poorly organized. This is what they were mostly habituated to in Western Francia, where it's not like they didn't have consistent infantry, but at large the population was disarmed, right? As we observed with the third, that wasn't in fact a professional nor a semi-professional force, if not in the feigned cadres, so to some degree of officiality. The however, population was more militarized, and making mass, they would actually resist the nightmarish to be faced Norman cavalry charges. Numerically, the backbone of William's army was formed by 4,000 infantrymen. Like the knights, they were equipped with lances and swords. A minority of them would be protected by chainmail, and their shield was either round or teardrop shaped. Yes, because there is this sort of this. You see also the Anglo-Saxons on the Bayeux tapestry have the kite-shaped shields. It was spreading pretty much all across Europe. The Byzantines had it, the Germans had it. That's a pretty universal design. However, the sense is that the migration Viking era shield was normally round, and so there is the idea that the Anglo-Danish in this case would have more of those in proportion than the kite-shaped ones that had historically been developed mostly to protect the riders' thighs. They, of course, would be useful also to protect a footman's one, also because, as we've seen, these knights also dismount to fight. Sometimes they're literally the same infantry. However, that's a bit different for the average infantryman. It is not as heavily armored, and the thinner part of the drop towards the lower part is less effective to protect. Of course, like the general function of the upper part was instead to protect the entire chest area. That is, of course, more important to be protected even, of course, than your legs. Additionally, in the Norman army there were 1,500 missile units that we do not have to underestimate, primarily consisting of archers and crossbowmen. There was a lot of javelin warfare around, as we will see. The Fyrd itself actually was partly of this. The same Norman knights at this point do not straight charge all the time with the couché lance script. As you can see from the Bayeux tapestry, many of them still didn't even have stirrups, right? I talked about these equestrian technologies, but they would operate, as far as their range capacity, by riding in front of the enemy lines, throwing javelins at close range. It's a very anti-armor effective weapon, trying to soften up the enemy ranks before the charge. Of course, supported by these other missile troops, so that especially the heavier cavalrymen wouldn't tire themselves down before the charge too much. They had to test the consistency of the enemy front line, so that actually cavalry charges were repeated during the battle. That's pretty much the case of Hastings, in also quite a desperate way, as we will see. During the month of preparation, William was tasked with ensuring that his diverse army lacked for nothing. Any inefficiency could spark dangerous discontent, undermining the cohesion of his forces. Over 30 days, at least 2,000 tons of supplies were required for both the men and their animals, necessitating careful gathering, storage in dry warehouses, and daily distribution. Dry weather in Normandy or England, as you know, is not quite frequent, especially in autumn, but this is the point. These armies knew perfectly well how to handle all of this. All the myth that, I don't know, the Mongols failed to conquer Europe because it rained in Hungary that year. Yeah, pretty solid explanation, which should also be applied to why did the Mongols manage to crush Russia, in winter, right? Invading it, crossing the frozen rivers of Eastern Europe. That is definitely not a dry climate. Of course, I made plenty of videos on why, of course, like the Mongols could have not conquered Europe, even if they had wanted it, really. Of these 2,000 tons of supplies, approximately 28 were of unground wheat for the soldiers, and for their horses between 12 and 18 of wheat, 13 to 20 of hay, and roughly 5 of straw, culminating in a total of over 40 tons per day. Right? Even though we don't have accurate documentary evidence, a horse and a man always eat more or less the same way, and so we can pretty precisely count how many resources were invested for this campaign. You understand, it's a crushing weight. Like, this is properly the hard work of thousands and thousands and thousands of people that fundamentally are applying themselves only to produce this stuff for the army, that are their lords, that are going to protect them and expand their power further. This logistical challenge would significantly impact the campaign's outcome. Of course, William could not sustain, for example, a prolonged war without adequate supplies, and would need to forcibly acquire them from Saxon villages in England, or retreat to his starting point, which definitely was a possibility, and also it came pretty close to happen. Finally, on September the 25th, which is the same of the Battle of Stamford Bridge, the expedition, the Norman expedition, set sail. Right, pretty fateful day. After 3 days of difficult navigation, again, rough seas, the Normans landed in Harold's personal territories, near the coastal town of Hastings in Wessex. This location marked the end of an ancient Roman road that connected the southern coast to London. William immediately began to scour the area for essential provisions, an effort that quickly alerted the Saxon king of his arrival. Harold, despite his skills as a commander, was swept up by his impulsiveness and made a decision that would significantly affect the campaign's outcome. Rushing back to London from the battlefield of Stamford Bridge, where he had just defeated the Norwegians, he hurried to confront William without fully assembling his troops. Instead, he called for a meeting on the battlefield for those who had lagged behind. This was partly motivated by the actual lack of resources from his own side, right? But William's were limited as well, so of course we do not know too much at least to the level of depth that we would like to, but of course there is something about this decision that would be pretty consequential for the campaign. The Anglo-Danish army, as we were pointing out before, consisted solely of foot soldiers. Its core comprised 800 huscarls, feared professional warriors, clad in long chainmail and armed with devastating two-handed Danish axes, among other weapons, such as, of course, the more basic spears and swords. Capable of inflicting severe wounds, they stood resilient against the Norman cavalry's charge. On the Bayeux tapestry you can see one of these huscarls basically splitting the head of a Norman horse like a cucumber. That was actually not the preferential use of the weapon, at least in order to stop a cavalry charge, right? The double-handed axe was better, of course, used once the spears had sort of blocked the cavalry's impact, and the individual Normans that had managed to break through had at a point to stop within this phalanx. If this had not broken, and they could be butchered down with these massive weapons that were properly designed even to break through armor, conceptually at least, right? There are lots of replicas testing that, of course, tell us that, say, in order to destroy an armor, you have to destroy the same weapon that destroys it. So, of course, it was much, but let's say the level of sort of physicality of these men, the potential of these weapons, like, could cause devastating trauma. And you don't need even just to break armor to basically bleed someone white from the within, or breaking their bones, etc. So this battlefield, Hastings, was a particularly, let's say, brutal engagement. Like, it's, of course, like every battle is, but at Hastings there were conflicting forces would sort of, be that, like, oppositely destructive against one another. The Anglo-Danish tactic was to form an impenetrable wall of shields and spears until the moment of hand-to-hand combat, at which point they would drop their defenses to deliver lethal blows, especially with their axes. And the general point, of course, of shield walls, I say it every time, to ruin the party, so of course that they have nothing special about it, right? Every single infantry ever using shields always used a shield wall in case, especially of pretty heavy missile fire. It's not a particular tactic or something that actually testifies to a particularly positive situation on the battlefield from their side. Important was the thickness of the ranks, the spears, right, that were sticking out of the shield wall, and so the general compactness of these forces, that if anything had to remain that compact, the more actually militia they were. Like the huscarls would have, at least of course in facing a Norman cavalry charge, that had to be pretty tight information. They had to remain pretty still, etc. But they would be much more preferentially individualistic, at least individualistically fighting, because they had the individual professionalism to act as such champions, right? Smashing to the enemy lines, being followed by the sort of weaker troops that instead had to be side to side. In fact, the flat shield, the round one of the migration era, the Viking era, was mostly designed for these militias that had to interlock their shields because, differently from other troops in history, like the Normans, for example, as knights, or even the Roman legionaries back in the day, actually didn't have that great deal of initiative from an individual point of view. So that's why, I don't know, a Huskar could sling his shield behind his back and just facing, as well armored as it was, the enemy with this double-handed axe that could chop people to pieces in great abundance in front of them. And mostly it's because you want to do that, right? It's the single most important thing. Secondly, of course, the physicality of this Northern Europeans, plus the sort of the nobiliar selection, or simply like the military one of these military careerists, was that important. These were very impressive men, bodily speaking. The same goes for the Normans. It takes a shocking athleticism to fight on horseback, right? The thanks must have been like some steamrollers there. And imagine this smashing to one another. Now, behind the Huskars, as we've seen, there was this lighter component of the Third that we can't count between 5 and 7,000. Again, I will make a video about the Battle of Hastings, reconstructing it from the sources, from the bunch of sources really we have about the battle as it went. That really shows you how, regardless of the publicity of the battle, of course, for obvious reasons, it's also really like a battle like others, right? It's the fact that it became so nationally relevant for Britain is perfectly understandable, but you really study it, say, almost autoptically like any other battle to some degree, the same coldness. So this third was a local militia, armed at best as they could be, right, ready themselves for battle. Though combat ready, they lacked discipline. They had poor collective training in general. Like, of course, there were some components of the third that were pretty good, especially the Thanes and their more. There was all a segmentation within the same third, right? There were the better men in the front leading the phalanx, so those were capable. But at large, as a broader body, they weren't, of course, as performing as the Huskars, needless to say. Their assignment was to continually harass the attackers using all kind of thrown weapons as well, such as javelins. This is very, again, migration Viking era style to a degree, but also arrows, clubs, stones. Some were very poorly armed. I mean, just imagine 11th century English country people, what could practically be. But that's also an advantage, because the wilder you are, the more you can do it with fewer means, except when you meet someone who is more collectively trained, actually the individual factor will actually fade. And of course, they were meant to join melee whenever the opportunity arose, right? When the file openers would break the enemy line, would open a gap into it, they would pour with the lighter elements into it behind them. Now, Harold's army had positioned itself on a hill that overlooked the road to London, a narrow and essential passage just 700 meters wide, compelling the invaders to confront unfavorable conditions. That's what a phalanx does. They had tested themselves uphill with this compact narrowly compact front and challenged the Norman cavalry to try breaking them. William had no choice but to attack and win. Warfare is really that simple, except it's very hard as well, and Hastings is a pretty good example of this. At 9 a.m. on October the 14th, the Norman archers began the assault, but their force proved largely ineffective. This is partially true, of course. Missile infantry is light infantry. By definition, it cannot annihilate the heavy one when numbers are, say, ratios forces are so obviously, like, there were even less than the Anglo-Danish heavy infantry. However, they partially contributed to soften up the frontal ranks of the enemy line. The infantry quickly followed, clashing against the Saxon shield wall. A third wave assailed the Saxons, this time led by knights. However, the uphill slope diminished their charge, and they too were repelled. It's a very interesting tactic because it shows how important, after all, infantry was in its specialties to, in itself, soften up an enemy formation before cavalry was sent in. So proving how, of course, the myth of the knights did not know about infantry potential, where it, of course, never occurred in the entire history of warfare. On the contrary, the Normans could motivate their own infantry to charge uphill against such a well-attested enemy, to fight and fail, to withdraw, to leave space to the knights, that however can't break the Anglo-Danish phalanx either. After approximately 3 hours of relentless assaults, punctuated by brief respites, William's Breton cavalry on the left flank faltered and trampled the infantry accompanying them as they fled. Remember that cavalry and infantry always act in tandem in these units. They're hardly ever separated. They always support each other. The collapse of the left flank is pretty serious. The Bretons broke for reasons that we do not know more in depth, but it could be that their cavalry was, as we observed before, slightly lighter than the Norman one. It's like, I don't know, the Anglo-Saxons could beat the Welsh on the frontier. So Celtic world had remained, after all, behind compared to the Latin Germanic one. In defiance of King Harold's orders, a group of feared pursued the retreating troops. This was quite dangerous because they were essentially weakening the solidity of the phalanx for those individualistic impulses that we were pointing out before. You must have virtue, individualism, to a degree in the troops, but this must be traumatically, as rigidly framed under an iron discipline that breaks your teeth even before you have anything to say when you make a mistake. Well, this was not exactly present there, right? Among the Norman knights, things were different. However, to make matters worse for the same Normans, rumors spread in that critical moment that William had been killed, instilling panic within his ranks. This was a typical ruse that would especially be carried out in the very critical moments of battle. Here things, as you understand, had heated themselves, like essentially all the components of the army from both sides had been engaged, had been spent to a degree. So even order, discipline, formation were loosening into some more, say, rationally violent Celtic engagement, during which it was naturally possible to spread these veritable fake news also through the employment of traitors, turncoats, people that would be even be distinguished by some features that allowed them to pass over during engagement to the other army and spread such news from the within. Say when a unit broke and there were some people retreating, some elements maybe that were not even deployed with the army but were in surroundings would join, I don't know, the enemy rear guards, the camp, etc., spread the voice that Duke William had died, which would have been also a likely event, given that, as we said, these leaders were not just expected but would fight in the first ranks, defying death and challenging the enemies, the finest of them, to single combat, etc. Naturally, William had to maintain control of this whole army. Everything depended on that. Not only he hadn't been killed, but at that point, learning of these fake news, removed his helmet, which was a very courageous thing to do, endangering his own life with all the kind of darts and stones flying all around, and rode boldly onto the battlefield in the face of the enemy, showing himself to everyone, right, reassuring thus his troops of his safety, and also showing the Anglo-Danish, like, this is the kind of leader that you're fighting against. Someone who is capable of endangering his own life because he understands so much the value of moral force, of the Imperium, of divine grace, that he knows that just out of this bravery he will be rewarded in spite of fear, terror that struck all involved. This is what a leader is made of. Rejuvenated by his presence, the Normans launched a vigorous counterattack against the reckless Saxons, inflicting significant casualties. An additional charge by the Norman cavalry was repelled once more, and for a second time the impetuous Saxons could not resist the lure of pursuing the fleeing foes, which led to a slaughter by William's reserves. This was in part what at that point was likely as willingly tried. Feigned flights in military history are most of the times actual flights, not in the sense that these people are physically getting out of the way, but because they start from real feints from real routes that, however, are saved at some point because troops can realign. This depends on the circumstance. Naturally, the Norman cavalry was that highly trained to make this back and forth, to say launch a charge, fall back, move across the battlefield. And the Normans had really given almost everything they had. They had not managed to break the Anglo-Danish force. Not even that gesture by William had really saved the day. The Normans, that were already tired, had launched yet another attack against the Anglo-Danish ranks, but had fallen back once again. At that point, the Anglo-Danish thought that the day was theirs, because they had repeatedly beaten Norman cavalry, which was an enormous deal, right? Everybody in England knew what that force was, and so imagine this man, like, they had already crushed, by the way, the Norwegians had come all the way from there, they had crossed Britain back and forth. They were fighting for their homeland, they wanted to kick the Normans out, so many of them lose their coolness. They disregard Harold's orders that naturally once a proper leader had injuncted them to stand their ground, not to abandon their posts, even in such cases. But again, that's also the civilizational gap that exists here. The Anglo-Danish do not quite respond to this, and they compromise the stability of the formation. The Bretons and the Normans instead had likely either cleverly employed the tactic of a feigned retreat to deceive their undisciplined adversaries, making it appear as though they were generally fleeing instead of intentionally retreating. It's also possible because, let's be honest, we do not know what actually happened at the Battle of Hastings. Like, the level of documentation is too scarce, right? It's not like later battles that we know more about, right? It may have been that actually a concealed reserve was hidden somewhere, and that the Normans used it at exactly this very critical moment of the battle, because it was either now or never, right? Here they were losing the battle. Actually, the Anglo-Danish had won, to be honest. It is possible that a flank attack by a concealed reserve was carried out. We will never know, because, of course, we do not have any other evidence to suggest it ever happened. In fact, it shouldn't even be technically proposed as an idea, if not just very hypothetically. But warfare was also made that way. Maybe, I don't know, maybe even the Anglo-Danish had a reserve, but they couldn't use it for some reason. Just we have too few information to know what happened. We know that warfare was that complicated, especially such a big battle would have entailed something more complex, I would say functionally complex, than what we can see from the relatively meager sources. As sunset approached, both armies were exhausted, and the outcome remained uncertain. However, it was clear that with nightfall, victory would favor the Anglo-Danish, as they were still masters of the battlefield. In a final desperate move, William ordered his infantry to attack, once again instructing their archers to fire arrows in arcs to rain down the Saxons from above, while the cavalry sought to exploit any gaps in the enemy's shield wall. That is to say, let's essentially dispirit whoever is backing the first lines that will be contemporarily dealt with by the cavalry. And so the story goes, and this is also legend more than factual history, that an arrow struck Harold in the eye, creating chaos among the already beleaguered Saxons. And seizing the opportunity, William's cavalry surged into battle, transforming the Anglo-Danish confusion into defeat. Despite his grave injury, Harold apparently remained on his feet, and William aimed to capture him alive. However, the Saxon king was ultimately reached and killed by 4 knights who were unaware of the duke's intentions. This can all be profitably debated. Again, we'll have to look at which sources, which traditions want this to have happen in this way. The same goes for the general events of the battle, right? All the sequence, the various phases. We must reconstruct it more thoroughly. However, these are the highlights from the more important sources. What is sure, that much, is that the Anglo-Danish army finally disintegrated, ruthlessly pursued by William's forces. And you know that the greatest bath of blood, in spite of this horrifyingly violent day of fighting, had yet to begin. Right? That's the moment in which you mow your enemy down, and literally you have the Norman horsemen running over these people and annihilating them physically. A massive trail of blood. It was just the beginning of what would occur in England. Not much in the south, but in the north. So the Norman victory was total. A Norman dynasty ascended to rule England, bringing it out of isolation. This is true. For example, and forcefully integrating it into the intricate power dynamics of Europe. Up to that point, the Anglo-Saxon world had remained relatively isolated, if anything, because it exists on an island, but also because it had historically developed a different political and social balance. You can argue that it's at this point that, at least what we have observed in the video about the Latin Germanic expansion, you have England being fully part of that Frankish world that at this point was expanding further, even just by imitation, all across the Roman West, and that would have herself contributed to expand it further. The Anglo-Normans invaded Ireland. They would later conquer Wales. They tried to subjugate Scotland, and truly they consolidated from their English superiority that order in the British Isles. They would participate to the Crusades. They would also contribute to recompact through various wars, of course, the same continental powers, especially France. So this is a moment in world history where really way more than it can be said was made, right? As we've seen, even a relatively modest battle, speaking of the mere numbers compared to others in history, in medieval history, but extremely momentful, right? Just there are a few other battles. We will talk about them at some point. Bouvines, we already discussed it, but Markfeld, Tagliacozzo, these are all big game changers for European order, and the world won as a consequence. Once William secured the English crown, he dedicated considerable time to suppressing the resistance throughout the Anglo-Danish world. To solidify his rule, he replaced local clergy with Norman bishops, implemented property assessment for taxation to fund military campaigns, and simultaneously curbed the power and autonomy of the barons. Until Henry I, like before the end of his reign, Anglo-Norman England had a shockingly centralizing potential. It was one of the single most solid monarchies in Europe. Yes, the idea of the Norman efficiency in state building, etc., has been profitably criticized. But you have also to consider that this was, again, Northern Europe, resources were scantier, and what was accomplished by the monarchy at the time, just in terms of effective administration of royal agents, would in relative terms be higher practically than throughout most medieval English history. You can appreciate, of course, these accomplishments through, for example, the information recorded in the Domesday Book. We will look at it more in depth in dedicated videos. This was a land registry that William is depicting carrying under his own arm in a statue at Lichfield Cathedral. The primary source regarding the battle is the so-called Bayeux tapestry if you prefer. The term itself is actually misleading. It's actually a large textile composed of 9 pieces of linen, totaling over 68 meters in length. Commissioned by William's half-brother, the Bishop Odo, that participated to the battle, it vividly illustrates the conquest of England and was intended to conclude with William's coronation, although that scene has been lost. Despite its propagandistic purpose, the tapestry, once incorrectly attributed to the Duke's wife Matilda, remains crucial for reconstructing the chronology and armaments of the battle. The tapestry alone is worthier than the documentary accounts. In fact, it's a quite unique source, as you understand. And the accounts themselves really show you how, in fact, important certain informations that we would, at least through our limited modern perception, consider secondary. Like, we would like to know how the battle technically unfolded, like in a video game, you know. But of course, what was more important for these people was all the status, the meaning, the morale, the general sense of accomplishment that the Norman conquest had been. Right? The same tapestry is for this reason the most important source on the battle. Who cares at the end of the day how the battle went? Right? We know the fundamentals, and that's it. We can study contemporary warfare in many other ways. There is no other battle. There is actually no other source of this kind. There are few other. There's the Baldishold tapestry for Scandinavia, but it's just very small thing. It's beautiful. It's a great source for Scandinavian knights of the era, but it's slightly later. Bayeux tapestry, but they're actually more or less at the same time. However, the most important thing here is, of course, not just the sequence, the sort of comic stripe, but with, as you know, the Latin tituli, etc. It's like a story, really. You have to read and watch like a movie. Like, that's how they conceived it with their own means. But aside from the iconographic evidence that is priceless, to say the least, as you can see also, of course, from the pictures that I used for the video, it's really the general worldview through the same images that really matter that much for these people to sing the battle in this way. It's the imposant presence of these Norman knights, right? The ultimate fall of these footmen, that they're challenging them, and the general movement. Like, one of the most beautiful things about the tapestries is the sense of becoming, right? When they say that Venerunt at prelium, that's, and you see the horses actually moving to the battle along the tapestry. That's alone pricelessly superior to any kind of battle account that you can read about the battle. I mean, if the chance were to have the Bayeux tapestry and burning the accounts, God forbids, burn the accounts, right? The tapestry itself tells you morally, even before iconographically, by far what you would like to know about this engagement. It's beautiful, right? You gotta be happy to wake up in the morning in a world in which you have the Bayeux tapestry. Of course, there are lots of other unfortunate things that we have to atone for, but let's say the Bayeux tapestry is one of the ones that can help us achieve this. How do you even conclude a video about Battle of Hastings? It's really impossible. It's something painful almost. I would like, of course, to have descended in much more detail into this clash. But this is also the point. Everything comes to an end, and it's what is left that matters. And this, I think, after Hastings, especially if you consider the loser side, is one of the greatest lessons in history. And there is a way you must actually appreciate history the way it's made, right? Nobody would apparently think in our own culture today that appreciating a slaughter, major fight, right, one that would open actually to pretty dark times in large parts of Britain, would be per se, in fact, a positive thing. Actually, it would be, right? It sounds terrible, but everything comes at a cost. And what the Anglo-Danish lost at Hastings was definitely regained by their descendants in a broader historical and national sense, in ways that I think we should all be thankful for, because if the Anglo-Saxon world is the way it is today, regardless, of course, of any consideration you could make about the world today in general, it is because of Hastings. And so we are obliged to understand what this was, why it happened, how it happened, and especially in the context of what was before and what was afterwards. I didn't make so many videos about medieval England as for other regions of Europe, tell the truth. I mean, we made, I think, let me check, as usual at the end, we lengthen a bit the content, not for just for the sake of itself, but, you know, the more we say, the more effective we can be. As I was saying at the beginning, talking about Hastings was one of the great issues of the channel. I don't know if anybody had noticed. Medieval England, Schwerpunkt history, talking age. Okay, 52 videos. Alright, I have a couple of others in store about medieval England from the cycle and the specials. So that actually, and we made too few indeed. There is no doubt that we made something. It's not like we haven't talked about it, but especially in the early days, we made videos that were they were too foundational, too generic. Instead, we have to descend properly in the depths of medieval England. That is really a unique system. I mean, so much so like any other one, you could argue, but of course in its own way, in a very precious fashion. I really don't want to add anything else. There is much, of course, about God's judgment, Harold's death, how the sources of later time, think about Snorri Sturluson, was running in the 13th century, and he's a major source in the battle, and we know that to an extent he was relatively fictionalizing some of the details, right? But even in that, you must understand what, say, retroactively, as contemporary, would have been believed about this, right? Why would such a huge event in that world, even for an Icelander, right? The Battle of Hastings had to be told that way, right? And what did this all mean for those who studied the battle ever since, not just at the time, which would in fact occur. Can't say much. I can't upload the pictures because technically in the museum they forbade you to take pictures of the tapestry in particular, but of course I made them anyway because, you know, that's where the hero has to fight against fate and win, as I did on that occasion. Break the law and just create your own if it's superior and blessed by God. These scents, however, being really immortalized in the same images that I hope were pleasant. I mean, surely they were pleasant and more pleasant than my monologue, but that are also beautifully the landscapes of the actual battlefield that we know, of course. This commemorative, I wouldn't know how to say, monument, stelates, something of this kind. Also pretty recent times, I think it was from the beginning of the 20th century. Just for telling you also regarding that, how actually relatively emphasized the importance of the single event really was. Like, no doubt, again, the consequences of Hastings are incalculable, but how, to an extent, of course, we leave these events through the memory of a later historiography that, of course, emphasized this thing. I mean, if England had not been the power that we know, it hadn't been a British Empire, etc., of course, like, we wouldn't remember Hastings more than much, right? Think this, that if, you know, the French had won the 7 Years' War, okay, they were still themselves invading England in a way, so that may have actually assumed even a greater meaning. But I mean, there is, especially for other battles in Europe, some sort of, what kind of battle was it? It was actually maybe even a much more important battle at the time, and possibly there are others that are, well, it's difficult to say because Hastings is really that momentous, as we were saying, but exactly because it's incalculable that, and exactly because of the historiographical sort of subjectivism that we are subjected to, we may have not fully appreciated, right, in the same way. I mean, how many people are so attached, for example, to the Battle of Bouvines? Everybody, at least all those who love medieval history, know why the Battle of Bouvines was so radically important. But let's say there weren't so many, English documentaries making the Battle of Bouvines, say, in common memory as the one that they did for Hastings, right? So the issue is somehow serious, because some means you're exposed to are, of course, messing with your own sense of, especially the wall, if at least there is not an equal, say, an objective distribution, at least on a specific criteria. However, the more we talk about the Battle of Hastings, the better it is, as for many other battles. For today, I just stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.